Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be Torath Mosheh versus Reform Judaism, but this time on the issue of intermarriage. I know what you're probably thinking. What now? How did you get to this topic? After the last few topics you've done about the Reform movement, how did you get to this one all of a sudden? Well, I had warned you in the previous video that I felt the need to cover a particular topic that was brought up in one of the I guess you could say, websites that I found concerning the reform movement, in particular to the issue of intermarriage. So going back over it, I won't commentate on this issue until after I finished. So essentially, when I went to this UK Reform Judaism website, they had a section called Reform Judaism in 1,000 words, intermarriage. So essentially what it says is the following: content. The classical Torah text on intermarriage does not set the tone that we as Reform Jews would want to set at the start of this discussion. Such couples and families receive a warm welcome across our movement. Nonetheless, it is the starting point for many of the challenges this issue has raised within Judaism throughout history. When the Eternal, your God, brings you into the land and dislodges many nations before you, grant them no terms and give them no quarter. You should not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons and take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods. Deuteronomy 7:1-4. It was an issue that sprang forwards, though, with the emancipation of Jewry from the 1770s onward, through which the full political and social acceptance that we now enjoy was attained, with all the new realities that brought. This included substantial social interaction with those of other faiths and none, a belief in romantic love rather than a reliance on arranged union, a diminishing of the importance of Jewish ethnicity and the concept of Jewish purity, and above all, a new legal reality in which civil marriage became an alternate to religious marriage, removing the power of rabbinic authorities to prevent such unions from taking place. The first thing we have learned in that prohibition that prohibition doesn't work. The divine command, you should not intermarry with them, has little weight in our communities. Being against intermarriage, as the parts of the Jewish world are, doesn't make it go away. The link between upbringing and who may marry is not straightforward. As the American Rabbi Lawrence Kushner writes, we now have enough data to say categorically that there is simply no way to stop Jews from marrying non-Jews. Fierce rabbinic bans are rigidly ineffective. Insulting forms of covert ostracism only make us look xenophobic and weak. We have learned something else too, and perhaps more importantly, that the passage from the Deuteronomy, as well as being ineffective, is also just plain wrong. The reason it gives for the prohibition, they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods, is not accurate. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, when I read this, and especially reading what this person's claiming and how it is not accurate and does not match what the Torah actually says on this issue, as well as what Halakha says on this issue, my response was like, wait a minute, what? Especially given the fact that this comes from the Reform movement, who is notorious for having issues right now with having fewer younger members and also having people leave completely, even with all the things that they do to try to make supposedly what they do acceptable to the Western world, and that being their goal, to meet the standards of the Western world and not to hold by truth and not to hold by the Torah. So as I mentioned in the previous video, this is something that the prophet Yeshayahu, the Navi Yeshayahu, said the following on. He says, "Hoi ho amorin le'orav tov ve'letov ra, samim choshech le'or ve'or lachoshech, samim mar le'matoch u'matoch le'mor, hoi hachochamim be'enehem, ve'neged panehem novonim, hoi giborim le'shtot yain, ve'anshe hayil lismoch shechor, מצדיקי ראשו, עיכב שוחד, וצדקת צדיקים יסירו ממנו." And as I mentioned in the previous video, translated, basically what he's saying here is like, oh, this is horrible that you have people saying that things that are good are bad and things that are bad are good. You have someone saying that darkness is light and that light is darkness. Something that is bitter is sweet. And essentially, these are people who are, wise in their own eyes. And this is the thing that he was actually mentioning, and this is something that, when I thought of, when I heard this, it was kind of like when I read this, from this article. And I'm going to cover exactly what the real issues about, not only the statement, but just the concept that is mentioned there and how inaccurate it is. So this video will address the following. First, why does the Torah Halakha really, what does it really state about intermarriage? Why does it state what it states about intermarriage? The next thing is that the reform response that I just read to you doesn't make any sense. And then the third thing is the reform response doesn't match what the Torah and Halakha state. So now let's deal with what the real issues are here. So let's start in a place that most people wouldn't think you start. He mentioned in that article the Torah. And essentially, what we want to do is start in an actual event that happened later than the Torah. It's mentioned in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So essentially, I'll read through and then I'll explain what's what going on here. So it says in Ezra 10:10, ويقوم Ezra الكهان ويمر لهم أتم معلتهم وتشيفوا נשים נוכריות להוסיף על אשמת ישראל. ועתה תנו תודה לאדוני אלוהי אבותיכם ועשו רצונו. והיבלעו מעמי הארץ ומן הנשים הנוכריות. ויענו כל הגהול ויאמרו כל גדול כי דברך כן כי דברך עלינו לעשות. So essentially what this is describing is a situation where Ezra and a number of other Jewish leaders led the people back to the land of Israel after being able to leave the exile that happened in Babylon. So essentially when they came back, they had started the process of trying to rebuild. And one of the things that had happened along with this is that a number of Jewish men had married women who were not Jewish. And it's not just the fact that they married women that are not Jewish, because essentially the Torah does give the situation where a Jewish man can marry a woman who converts to Torath Mosheh. That's completely acceptable. In this situation, the women that they had married had not taken on the conversion to Torath Mosheh. And these men had, basically children with these wives. Now, the basic issue here is that in doing so, essentially what it's like saying is that they had wives that were not on board with what the Torah was, going by, and they had brought them back to the land of Israel. So what you see in the green is what Ezra mentions to them, is that they had brought these wives who were foreign wives, and it's the shame of Israel. And again, it's not because the wives were foreign; it's because of the fact that they did not accept the Torah and they were not holding by the Torah. So what he basically says is that, essentially that, that the situation had been created where it's kind of like a mixing up of the true intentions of the Torah, and as well as like what Hashem had given to the people of Israel to be, in a sense. And then essentially the next thing that's mentioned is, that he had, that the entire, group of people that were there, realizing the mistakes that they had made, not just like simply because he said so, but realizing, in action that, the difficulties they were having in bringing, the women that they had married from this foreign culture. And it's not just foreign in the sense that it's a different country, but talking about culturally, and also in terms of the goal of the culture was completely opposite to what the Torah had, and also what the Jewish people were doing. That the people said, okay, well, whatever we're supposed to do because of the mistakes that we made here, we'll do it. So whatever the response is, we'll respond to it in the way that you say. Now it picks up later on in Nehemiah, which is another section. And at one point, these are considered to be like one text, but Nehemiah covers like a different historical angle somewhat. So it mentions here, Ushar ha'am ha'go'onim ha'lewiyim ha'she'arim ha'mosririm ha'nitonim b'chol ha'nivdol me'amei ha'aratzot ala torat ha'elohim nashaham benaham uvanethaham kol yodea mavin. מזיקין על אחיהם, אדיריהם, ובאים בעולו, ובשבועו, ללכת בתורת האלוהים, אשר ניתנו ביד משה עבד האלוהים, ולשמור ולעשות את כל מצוות אדוני אדוננו, ומשפטו והוגו. So here, it records kind of the later response to, the changes that were being made socially, because of this mistake that had been made. And basically the need to make a certain separation between the people of Israel who kept Torah and the rest of the nations who didn't keep Torah. And especially at this time, you had a situation where there was pretty much the Torah, and then you had Am Yisrael keeping the Torah, and you had Avodah Zarah all over the world. We know that it's forbidden for the Jewish people to do Avodah Zarah. So what's mentioned in the green is, concerning this issue about a need to make a separation here between the culture that had been accepted from the nations because of the fact of the exile, and what needed to happen. But and this is on a level of the entire society, for the Jewish people at that time. And in the yellow, basically, it talks about like the idea of trying to strengthen the entire society back to the Torah that Hashem gave, and not only just like this kind of like face, kind of situation of yeah, we're going to just do this Torah thing, kind of the way we want to do it, and not listen the way that Hashem gave it, but it specifically says the way that Moshe Rabbeinu had received it from Hashem, and also the way that Hashem had given it, including all the statutes and all the mitzvot and all of the judgments that had been given by Hashem. So, in order to understand this issue even further, in a way that would make sense to someone who's hearing it modernly, because someone may listen to it and say, "Okay, well, that's xenophobia. That's 100% racism." Think of it along these lines. You have on the left side here a man who's from Ghana, who is from the Ghanaian culture, was born in Ghana, and Ghana is in West Africa. On the right, you have a woman who's from Kurdistan. Kurdistan being here in the Middle East. So imagine the following scenario. Imagine that the two of them meet somewhere and decide that they, love each other and they want to form a relationship. But imagine that the man from Ghana is 100% in every single area and angle Ghanaian and is dedicated to being Ghanaian, wants to live in Ghana, wants to raise his children in Ghana, and wants all of the things that he does as a lifestyle to revolve around Ghanaian culture because that's what he likes, that's what he has to do, and he feels a responsibility to do so as a Ghanaian citizen. On the other hand, let's say that you have the woman who's from Kurdistan. She's 100% dedicated to Kurdistan. She's 100% dedicated to her culture, wants to live in Kurdistan, wants to raise children there, wants to, basically speak the language, live the lifestyle. And, that's her 100% dedication. So take these two groups of people, these two individuals, and say, okay, I love you, I want to get married. Okay, where do they live? Both of them are not willing, on both sides, they're 100% dedicated to their nations, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. They're perfectly dedicated to their cultures, their languages, and things like that. But the problem now you get into is, okay, well, at some point, someone's going to have to give. Someone's going to have to decide, for example, let's say the woman, she may have to decide, okay, because I want to be with this person and raise a family with them, I'm going to have to give up on that Kurdistan stuff that I was talking about. My country, I have to leave that behind and live in Ghana in his country. My culture, there's elements of that I may have to leave behind because there's not any, not enough or not that many people from Kurdistan living in Ghana. My language, I'm not going to be speaking Kurdistan that often, the Kurdistan language, that often. Or vice versa. If the man decides he wants to be with her, he's going to have to accept her culture and move to Kurdistan, accept the citizenship from there, to speak the language, culture, things like that. And in every scenario of this situation, there is no real scenario where they can say, okay, well, I can 100% do what I want to do in my country as a national of my country, someone who's a citizen of my country, living in my country and not leaving my country. You can't have it both ways. At some point, something's going to have to give, and someone's going to have to decide to either take on the culture of the other country, of the other person's background, or they're going to have to say, okay, well, this isn't going to work. We have to completely dissolve this. I can't do it. It's not going to work. You've got your culture and there's nothing wrong with it. I've got mine. There's nothing wrong with it. But we can't build a relationship together, with the goals that we want. I want to 100% be from Kurdistan. The man would say, I want 100% be from Ghana. I want my children to be raised in Ghana as a Ghanaian citizen. And you look at the citizenship situation. When you take on citizenship of a country, you accept certain things that come from the legal system of that country as well as the cultural norms of that country. So this is the basis that I want to build everything that I'm mentioning now going forward. So in order to understand what this means from a Torah perspective, one of the problems that comes up when this conversation happens, and I think it's the problem of the article that I mentioned from the Reform movement earlier, is the issue of as far as Torah and Halakha is concerned, there are two different sets of being Jewish, if you will. One of them is where you're biologically Jewish, which on a great level doesn't really mean much by itself. The other side of it is where we're part of what's called Kalal Yisrael or Kahal Hashem. Now, what does this mean exactly? The Rambam in the Pirush in the Mishnah explains the following, and he says, "V'ka'asher yiyu kayamim la'adam kol hayasadot halalu v'amonoto b'hem amitit harehu nichnas bichalal Yisrael." That's in the green. So what he says in the green, and he's talking about the 13 foundations that I had mentioned in the previous video. And if you look up, like in English, they usually say 13 principles of faith, but it's not really principles of faith. It's more like the 13 foundations of the Torah. So what he mentions is that when a person accepts all of this, and he's talking about a Jew. He's talking about someone who's Jewish who accepts all of this, these foundations of the Torah. Then that person is considered to be have entered into what's called Kalal Yisrael. Now he further says in the yellow, "V'ka'asher v'yikpakpek Adam b'yesod me'elu hayesodot harei ze yatzad min ha'chalal ve'kafar be'ikar ve'nikora min ha'epikoros ve'kotzetz b'notiyot." So essentially what he says is here in the yellow is that when you have someone who brings doubt into the issue of the foundations of the Torah, um, and essentially, this person has left, the kalal of, that we're talking about, the kalal Israel, and they have been kafar be'ikar, so they have kind of gone against, they're like almost like, if you will, in English you would say heretic too, but it's a little bit deeper than that. The one of the basic principles, like almost like the roots of the Torah. And then this person is known as Epicurus. So essentially, what you have here is a situation. You could have someone who's 100% biologically Jewish going back thousands of years, but the minute that they reject the Torah, according to Halacha, according to what the Rambam says, and also this is from the Mishnah and things that we mentioned earlier in the previous video, they're considered to be outside of the Kalal Yisrael. So again, you could have someone who's 100% biologically Jewish, but not be a part of Kalal Yisrael or Kahal Yisrael, because being a part of Kalal Yisrael or Kahal Yisrael is defined according to Torah and Halacha as being someone who keeps the mitzvot and holds by the foundations of the Torah. So again, that doesn't mean that a person doesn't make mistakes. That doesn't mean that they don't have faulty ideas sometimes, but it means that they have 100% or they 100% hold by the understanding of the Yesudot, the foundations of the Torah that are mentioned, from the Torah, and that, of course, there's different people who have different formulations, but generally speaking, like for example, everybody who's a part of Kalal Yisrael of Kahal Hashem knows for a fact that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, and Hashem spoke it, and that at the end of his time, Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah from Hashem. Those are, for example, two basic things that everybody accepts who's a part of Kalal Yisrael or Kahal Hashem. Someone who's biologically Jewish but doesn't accept that would just be simply biologically Jewish, and beyond that, it is what it is. Now, in terms of, well, I mentioned this in the previous video. If you look at Rav Saad Gaon in his book Emunot V'Deot, when Amar Hamishi, he says the following: Habilti shalem, aval habilti shalem hu mezalzel b'mitzvot v'hamesiyot, v'hu she'amrim alav over al mitzvot aseh. והוא כגון מי שזה מזלזל בציצית ותפילין ובסוכו ובלולב ובשופר וכל הדומה לכך, והרי הוא בחטא בהדרגה זו. So what he mentions here in the green is again what we mentioned was the bilti shalem. So someone who's almost like, it's like saying somebody who's not complete. So this is a Jew, for example, may kind of go against the doing of mitzvot. For example, this one may say, person may say that there's a certain mitzvah that we're required to do, mitzvah aseh. So he goes against it. So mitzvah aseh says, Jewish people, Jewish men put on tzitzit. So the person says, nope, not doing that. Another person may say, okay, well, I'm not putting on tefillin. I'm not building a sukkah during Sukkot, Chag Sukkot. I'm not doing the lulav, the etrog, the shofar, don't care, I'm not doing any of that stuff. And then he lists below, hakofer, and in the yellow, aval hakofer, hu ha'ozev et ha'yesod. So essentially he says the kofer is someone who essentially has left, one of the yesods, one of the foundations of the Torah. So what's important to note here is that when halakha talks about the type of people that we're talking about now, that meaning that someone is 100% a kofer or epikuros, it's generally speaking meaning that someone who, for example, knew the truth, knew, for example, that Hashem gave the Torah, had known this very clearly, and then decides to walk away from it for whatever reason. That kind of person is classically understood to be in these categories that we're mentioning here. Someone, for example, who wasn't raised in the Torah and only maybe goes against the Torah because they don't know and they were never exposed to it, they never had someone explain it to them correctly. Those kind of people are not considered 100% to be in this unless they go the rest of their lives that way, for example. So at any time, someone could make what's called in Hebrew shuvah, to return to the Torah and say, okay, look, I've never was taught this stuff. Wow, this is interesting. Let me learn more about it. And that's where that has to be kind of balanced with this information. So going to the Mishnah Torah, dealing specifically now with this issue and how we get into the marriage issue with everything that we've listed so far. In the Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Ishut, Perek Aleph, it basically mentions the following. Kodem matan Torah hoyo odam pogea וראה אישו בשוק אם רוצה הוא והיא לישוא אותו, מכניסה לביתו ובעלו, בינו ולבין עצמו, ותהיה לו לאישו. Now, what he mentions there is before the Torah was given. Essentially, this is for anybody, whether they're from, the descendants of Abraham, anyone. If a man were to like meet a woman in the like the market, for example, and he wants and she wants to basically, like get married, all that would have to happen is he would have to like, bring her into his house and then like do what married people do, and pretty much that's his wife. So getting in the green now, it says, Kivan shenitnat Torah nitzavu Yisrael she'im yirtzeh ish lisa isha yikne otha tachilo bifnei aidin v'achar chok tiye lo leisha. So essentially what it says in the green is that after the Torah was given, or like you can say when the Torah was given, the mitzvah, for a Jewish man became different now. So a Jewish man is required that when he wants to marry a woman, he has to go through a process of negotiating with the family, negotiating with her, and he has to present, a certain payment. Because essentially it's like saying, okay, if he's showing up to her father, because most Jews, especially ancient times, married young, essentially what you're taking away from the father is, someone who's working in his household. Essentially all of his children, working in the household. So that's something that you have to have an agreement on, including with the wife, because she has to say yes to it too. It's not like you can just walk up to some guy and say, hey, I want your daughter, and then she's being dragged away. No, it's like she has to say, yes, that's what I want to do. And the classic situation of how this is understood comes from the story of Rivka, when she, basically when Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, was looking for a wife for his son Yitzhak, and he sent his servant to go like to where his family was and be able to like bring a wife back. And remember, if you look at the story, essentially what happened was that she agreed to go, and the family was given a lot of stuff, in replacement of the type of work that she was going to be doing, and they were going to be losing by her moving and marrying. So essentially, what happens here is that we understand that from the Torah, after the Torah was given at Har Sinai, the way that Jewish people were marrying, the way that Israel, the people of Israel, were marrying was different than the way that the rest of the nations work. So, for example, up until this time now, according to this view, the non-Jewish world can still marry in the way that is mentioned here. That essentially, someone says, "Hey, I like you, you like me. Come back to my house, and then you're my wife." Perfectly fine. That's perfectly acceptable according to the way the Torah presents the situation. But if it's someone who's Jewish, there's a process that has to happen when a Jewish man marries a Jewish woman. So now going into Hilchot Isure Bia, Perek Yud Bet. This is still in the Mishnah Torah. And this deals with what the Rambam mentions the following, where he says in the green, Yisrael sheba'al goya, Joyon, Mishor ha'umot, derech ishut, או ישראל שנבעלו לרוי, דרך אישות הרי אלו לוקין מן התורה שנאמר לא תתחתן בו. So in the green, what he says here is that according to the Torah, it's a sur for someone who is Yisrael, either man or woman, to basically marry someone who's not a part of what's Kalal Yisrael or Kahal Hashem, for example. And basically to marry someone as a part of the people of Israel. Of course, when this is talking about, is all talking about Kalal Yisrael, Kal Yisrael, because of course someone who's outside of that would be not someone, someone wouldn't be searching to marry in someone outside of the Kalal of Kal Hashem. And we'll explain later why that is, because it's not just a matter of, okay, don't marry someone who's not Jewish, done. There's reasonings for it, and if people look at the reasonings based upon the example I gave earlier of the Kurdistan woman and the man from Ghana, it'll be more clear when we get to that point. So it says, so the first thing is that the one of the isurs, the forbidden prohibitions of this, deals with the 7 nations, the Canaanim, the Canaanite nations that were in the land of Israel at one point, and the rest is the rest of the world. But it says in the yellow, "V'chen meforash al yedei Azra, v'asher lo niten benotenu la'amei haaretz, v'et benothehem lo nikach levenenu." Nehemiah Yud Lamed Aleph. Below Asuru Torah Ela Derech Chatanut. So essentially what the Rambam quotes here is he quotes from the book of Nehemiah, which we had mentioned earlier, for example, about the issue of that the Jewish people decided at that point when they had returned after the exile to Babylon, that when they were building the temple, that they were trying to rebuild the Torah society that had once existed, that they would not do what they had done in Babel and marrying people who had not converted to the Torah. Meaning that if someone had converted to the Torah, they're outside of the scope of what's being mentioned here, because they can a Jewish man can 100% marry let's say a woman from China who converted. He can 100% marry her. She's 100% part of Kalal Yisrael once she's done the conversion the right way, through the right methodologies giving ba'alacha, which I've mentioned in other videos. So then, this is the other important issue that very seldom gets discussed in this issue, and which is important to understand in terms of this issue. So in Hilchot Isur Rabia, Perek Dalet, it says the following. הנידה הרי היא כשאר כל העריות והמערה בו, בין כדרכו, בין שלא כדרכו, חייב כרת. So essentially, according to the Torah, it is forbidden for a Jewish man to have relationships with a woman who is in what's called nida, meaning that she's been in menstruation. So during that time, as well as during the time when she hasn't gone to what's called a mikvah, after her time is over, it's forbidden for him to have physical contact with her and relationships with her. He can of course he has to be that has to be his wife first and foremost. That has to be his wife. But the important thing to understand about this is that the punishment for this is considered karet. Karet is meaning that when a Jewish man passes away, there is no olam haba for him. If he continues in the practices that cause karet and never makes shuvah, never returns to the Torah, never repents from what he had done, for example, then basically that's when that kicks in. But a man who willingly knows that he's with a woman that is in nidah, is basically committing what's called an avera in Hebrew. He's going against the Torah. He's transgressing the Torah by doing so. If he wants to be with his, woman that's his wife, all that has to happen is she has to go to the mikveh, once she's done with the time of nidah. So he mentions further in the green, Hagoyim, en chayavim alehem mishum nido, velo mishum zavo, velo mishum yoledet. והחכמים גזרו על כל הגויים, זכורים ונקבות, שהיו כזבים תמיד, בין ראו בין לא ראו, לעניין טומאו טהרו. So essentially what he says is that someone who's not Jewish doesn't have any mitzvot concerning like nidah. They don't have the mitzvot to do what Jews have to do in this area. So it's not applicable to them at all, including, like what has to happen when a woman gives birth. There's a certain period of time that she, her and her husband don't have relationships until she's going to a mikvah when that period is over. The non-Jewish nations that'll have that. So it's not applicable. So let's say, as an example, someone who's Reformed decides to marry someone who's not Jewish, and they say, okay, well, fine, I'm going to marry her, and she's going to go to the mikveh. She didn't want to convert. She doesn't want to join the Torah, the way that the Torah halacha states to do it, the way Hashem commanded to do it. But she's going to agree to go to the mikveh. Well, it doesn't mean anything. She has no mitzvah to do that, so there's nothing that's gained from her dunking herself in a mikveh. It doesn't change anything. She's still in the same situation she was in before. The optimal situation would be that she accepts the Torah and lives as a Jewish woman, which is acceptable according to the Torah. But someone who were to say, okay, look, I know all this stuff exists, I'm not doing that stuff, well, that's, transgression of the Torah. And again, what happens, in terms of like when they have children and things like that goes back to that previous example I gave. So further in Hilkot Isur Rabia, Perek Dalet, it says, "Ve'achad haba'al anida kol shiv'at hayomim." And this is basically what it's saying, like someone who comes upon a woman who's, who's in nidah, like for 7 days. And it mentions something that's very interesting here. In the green, it says, "Ben shivho, ben mishuchoreret, hakol becharet." So, for example, let's say that a Jewish man, decides, okay, well, he doesn't keep the Torah, or in this area he's not going to keep it, or he doesn't keep it at all. And he says, okay, well, wait a minute, this woman I'm marrying, it's she's decided to keep the mitzvot that are, required of a Jewish woman. As long as she does those things, it's perfectly fine. She doesn't have to convert. She doesn't have to go through an Orthodox Bet Din. That's perfectly fine. According to this, that's also wrong because a shivcha has, mishuchoreret has pretty much the same mitzvot as any woman, a Jewish woman does. So because they have the same mitzvot, for example, he's not gaining anything in this situation. She's, be like no different than a shuchoreret or a shivcha. So by like token, he would still have karet because of the fact that he's going against what the Torah says or accepting the idea of going against what the Torah says. So one of the important things to mention here, and this is one of the things that I think doesn't get thrown out there enough, especially when this issue comes up with people who are Reform or even conservative, when this idea of the whole intermarriage thing comes up, because it's way beyond the idea of intermarriage. This was not an issue amongst Mizrahi, Temani, African, and Asian Jewish communities. This was not really an issue. Pretty much, if there was a situation where some guy was not, with the right person, convert him, done. Get it out of the way. But again, it wasn't just like willy-nilly people were throwing conversions all over the place. You don't really have this issue when you look at information of Jewish men and Jewish women like marrying off to like non-Jews, unless they had full-fledged made the decision to leave the Jewish community. Under those circumstances, you may have a situation where someone decides, I'm going to marry this person not Jewish, but I'm leaving the Jewish community in order to do so. Not because the Jewish community is going to chase me down, mainly because the non-Jewish communities in those areas would have had a big problem with someone who's Jewish marrying their daughter, so to speak, or something like that. Or the idea of someone is a Jewish woman, okay, you got to come over to this side. You're not staying over in the Jewish side. That didn't exist. So that's one of the reasons that when you look at the situation of the Avot in the Torah, they were very particular about who they were going to marry because of the fact that they had a certain mission that they were trying to accomplish. And essentially, the type of men and women that they would marry could affect that mission, the type of children they could have. And even under the best of circumstances of marrying the right woman, marrying the right man, the Avot sometimes had issues with their children choosing not to do the Torah or walking away from the Torah. That's a thing that actually exists. And it's something that can happen even under the best of circumstances, but happens more under the worst. And again, you have a situation in the Torah. There's nothing wrong with someone joining the Jewish nation by becoming what's called a ger tzedek. People of the nations have always been open to join the Torah as long as they're willing to accept again the citizenship of the Torah. That means that when there's the mitzvot that are required to be done by a Jew, a person who becomes a ger is exactly like a Jew. The only difference between a ger tzedek and a Jew is that someone who was born Jewish was born Jewish. That's the only difference. A ger tzedek is a Jew because they've converted and they're just as Jewish, with a couple of exceptions because of the fact that they're joining a new nation. Mainly being that they can't marry, like for example, Cohen. They can't be a king, for example, things like that. But that's understandable when you deal with the fact that this is someone who's coming into a new nation. But once they have children with someone who's Jewish, their children 100% a part of the Kahal Yisrael, the Kalal Yisrael. And a person who converts is considered to be a part of Kalal Yisrael. So let's say that you had to weigh between someone who converted and keeps the Torah and someone who was born Jewish and doesn't keep the Torah. Of course, a person would say, okay, well, this is my cousin, for example. He doesn't keep the Torah, because of whatever reasons. I'm not going to completely push him to the side. But when it comes to Kalal Yisrael, this person who converted is in there, I'm in there, and everyone who keeps the Torah is in Kalal Yisrael or Kahal Hashem. But any Jew who doesn't keep the Torah is not within the Kalal or in the Kahal, according to the halachic definition of it. So this is where I think that this is where the problem gets mixed up with this whole idea, because people sometimes don't understand. What is not understood is that if you're talking about being biologically Jewish, fine, you're biologically Jewish, not a problem. We recognize that, good for you. But there's a difference between being biologically Jewish and being part of the Kahal Yisrael, the Kahal Hashem, or being part of the Kalal Yisrael. Meaning again that Kalal Yisrael and Kalal Hashem hold by the Torah and the mitzvot, and even if they make mistakes in it, they hold by the foundations of it. So going back again, when you look at Middle Eastern Jewish communities, you don't have the situation of intermarriage being this big thing, or like, we're losing Jews all over the place because they weren't intermarry. No, you were a Jew in a lot of these countries. It was pretty clear that you were going to be marrying the Jewish community, and that's the thing that helped those communities survive into the present era. There's even here in Israel, there are Jews from certain Jewish communities that don't marry outside of even their own communities to this day, whether they keep the Torah or not. So this whole thing that was being presented in this article is completely contrary to the reality that existed in the Middle East and different parts of Africa and Asia. The main thing for example, in Europe, of course, was this idea that there was a certain point where the society, supposedly made it seem as if Jews could be just like everyone else. And at some points, there's a lot of places in the West that Jews are reminded you're not like everyone else. So a decision has to be made. But again, when looking for someone who's going to help, like let's say you have a Jewish man who's looking for someone who's going to help him keep the Torah. He's going to, if he's trying to keep the Torah, he's going to be looking for someone who's Jewish. Let's say you have a Jewish man who wants his son to marry someone that's going to help him continue the Torah into his grandchildren's age, his great grandchildren's age. He's going to be looking for, a wife for his son who keeps the Torah and who's from a Jewish family who keeps the Torah, because the connections are going to be there. He could even look for a woman who is converted, to marry his son, and that's not a problem. But when you say, okay, well, here's a person who doesn't have the loyalty to the nation that I have. This person can choose to have the loyalty or not choose to have the loyalty. That's a problem. The basic issues of the person saying, well, I'm going to marry this person even though Hashem said not to do it in this way. Well, that's what's called in Hebrew kefirah against Hashem. This is someone who's trying to look for a way out of the Torah. And under those circumstances, you could say the person is almost like this, like they're not in Kalal Yisrael or Kahal Yisrael. But again, that's the halakhic definitions of such. And I think if the halakhic definitions were what the discussion was under, it'd be more understandable to people that this is not some xenophobic, and hate-mongering, ostracizing situation. This is a situation where someone's actually concerned about someone being in Kahal Yisrael, which is where the Torah is in the whole picture. And again, if a person says, "Well, I don't want the Torah," okay, then fine. Then you would have to accept that, like, let's say you go to a synagogue and you want to be what's called shiliach sibur, meaning that you lead the community in the prayer. But you say, "I don't believe in Hashem." Well, obviously, if you don't believe in Hashem, you can't lead the kahal in a tefillah, in prayer. I mean, obviously you can't. You say you want to read from the Torah, in a place where everybody's reading it for themselves, and you don't keep the Torah. Who's to say that you won't change the meaning of the text? So this is where a man who's Jewish would be looking for someone who keeps the Torah if he's a part of Kal Yisrael. If he's not, then he might not care. So now, if we really dig, deep into this issue, as I always try to do when discussing these matters, we've discussed this idea that in communities where Torath Mosheh was the primary function, and there wasn't this attempt to try to, for example, mix within the host society, for example, you had a situation where this was not an issue. This is not a question because of the fact that it makes sense what Hashem commanded in the Torah, especially when you look at the fact that the people of Israel have a mission that's been given to them. And the only way to accomplish that mission in the land of Israel is to have people 100% dedicated to it, because you have to ask the question. Let's say that a Jewish man meets a woman that he likes, and he's 100% dedicated to the Torah, to the land of Israel. And she says, "Look, I like you and all, I love you and all, but I'm not dedicated to that Torah stuff. I'm not going to like some pool, some mikvah every time I have to do menstruation. I'm not doing any of that stuff. I'm not going to like, keep Passover. I want to teach my kids about, let's say, for example, someone's a Christian. She may want to teach her kids about Christmas. In a Torah-based house, Christmas is Avodah Zarah. So obviously, the only man who would be willing to accept that would be someone who doesn't care about the Torah, and who is either because of his upbringing or his own choices has distanced himself from the Torah. Um, and that's one of the things that's been considered. That's not Torath Mosheh. That's something completely different. And if the idea is that, someone says, "I've been emancipated from the Torah," okay, well then you need to act, that's that out, and you have to expect that that the understanding is then that you are outside of the kahal, or outside of the kalal, which again makes something different. That's something completely foreign to the Torah, which it would seem to me, again, as I mentioned in the previous video, that if that's what people think, that they should change their Torah to what actually happened in their own minds, or to change or remove these areas that they say are so wrong. Because essentially, when a person says the Torah is incorrect, if Hashem gave the Torah, you're also saying Hashem is incorrect. And this is the thing that is to be considered. So let's think about this. Let's consider everything we've gotten to this point. Now that you've heard everything you've heard from the Torath Mosheh perspective, think about the question of, okay, well, what exactly is the problem with intermarriage from a Torah-based perspective? Is it just simply, as the Reform person in their article was mentioning, of people being led, Jews being led away to other gods? Well, the problem is, as I mentioned in the previous video, the word in Hebrew for Elohim doesn't mean what God means in English. Essentially, Elohim could be power, it could be people, it could be a melachim. It could be, a thing. You could talk about the creator. Anything that a person allows to get between them and the creator of all things is an Elohim to that person. And if you will, it's like becomes a god to that person. So let's say, for example, a person says, okay, I know that by marrying this person, I'm going to be outside of Kalal Yisrael, Kahal Hashem. That's perfectly fine by me. Well, then that situation becomes an Elohim to you. That person becomes an Elohim to you. So exactly what the Torah says has happened. A person says, I know that if I marry this person and they're in Nida, and that because they're not Jewish, unless they convert and become Jewish, for example, through the unorthodox means nowadays, meaning that a Torah-based, methodology, I know that this person will be still in Nida, and it's a sword for me. It's a forbidden for me to be in a situation where someone is Nida, to be, in a physical relationship with someone who's Nida. I know that's a sword, but I'm going to do it anyway. Then that situation has become an Elohim to that person. Exactly what the Torah said. Let's say you have a man who's willing to say, okay, my son's going to marry this person, and they haven't converted, and because of that, my grandchildren won't be considered Jewish, but that's perfectly fine. It doesn't matter to me. Then that situation has become an Elohim to the person. Exactly what the Torah talks about is exactly what the person in the article from the Reform movement is basically advocating. And also the fact that the person's willing to say that the Torah, is incorrect in this area, but then they still use the Torah, which doesn't make any sense. If it's wrong, you seem like somebody would say, okay, let's not even use this text if it has the content that the person's mentioning. that has become an Elohim to that person. This person's idea, that they have has become an Elohim to them. The idea that they've been emancipated from the Torah, but yet they still try to hold on to the Torah as if they haven't. It's really, like I say, it becomes strange. But essentially, what the Torah says is exactly what they're talking about. And the people of Israel have been here before. And if you look at, again, when we looked at Ezra and Nehemiah, they were in that situation. And then at some point when they made Shuvah in the land of Israel, they made a decision. Okay, anyone whose wives or children are not willing to keep the Torah and be a part of this nation, they have to go back to where they came from if that's what they're wanting to do. And again, it'd be no different than we mentioned the Ghanaian guy and the woman from Kurdistan, that they decide, okay, well, let's say they're outside of Kurdistan and Ghana, and they decide, okay, I love you, I want to get married. You have to move to Ghana. And the woman says, no, you have to move to Kurdistan. And it's like, well, you have to take on, Twi, my language. No, you have to come to Kurdistan and speak my language. I mean, you have to take on my culture. No, you have to take on my culture. At some point, nothing's going to work. Someone's going to have to give at some point and decide to take on as much as possible the other nations, like situation, cultures, language, things like that. As I've mentioned in the previous videos, what you end up having is a situation where one path leads to, the nations. It's not about the Torah. It's not about Hashem. It's not about the truth. Where the other path, eventually leads to Hashem, and doesn't mean that, Torath Mosheh Jews and Orthodox Jews don't have issues and problems. We do, but eventually the path is leading back to where all the people of Israel are coming back to the land of Israel and to the Torah. There's people who have actually made shuvah from, things like these ideas that we're mentioning in this video. So, again, it's important to note that the goals are different. As we mentioned before, you have you have people who are parts of different nations who are dedicated to those nations 100%. At some point, two people who are dedicated to their own individual nations are going to have a hard time trying to build a life when their dedications are completely in two different locations, if you will. So in conclusion, as I've mentioned in the previous videos, Reform Judaism claims, or the Reform Judaism claims, are completely foreign to Torath Mosheh, and now we understand why a little bit deeper. They appear to change like the weather, as I mentioned in the previous video, and are the result of their attempt to distance themselves from the accurate Torah that Hashem gave at Mount Sinai for the sake of being like the nations.